Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. And today we are on a season 5 apologetics episode. So, season 5, we're focused on apologetics, and this episode is on world religions. We have two guests on. Doctors Terry Muck and Harold Netland. They both co-edited the book published by Baker, Handbook of Religion, a Christian engagement with traditions, teachings, and practices. So if you guys are on YouTube, you can see me holding this book up right now. We'll jump into this conversation here in a moment, but some housekeeping reminders on our show notes. There's going to be a link to Baker. Pick up the book for yourself. It's a really good reference book to have on your bookshelf, talking about all the religions that you would expect to have in there, plus some other ones. Great research into this. They're experts on this field of study, as all our episodes in the apologetics season. Each topic, we have experts on that field of study on. And so click that link, get this book. There's also a link to find the closest confessional Reformed churches near your area. So very important thing to be a part of a church and worship our holy God in person. So please click that link. If you're not already part of a church, click that link, check one out, or refer one to somebody else that you know. And then you can obviously communicate with Peter or myself, ask us questions, anything like that. We're pretty active on social media. So Twitter and Instagram, if you guys don't already know that. And our handle is @GuiltGracePod for both. We are on YouTube. You heard me mention these conversations are recorded with the video, so we throw them up on YouTube. And so if that's a better platform for you guys to engage with, please, by all means, go on YouTube and subscribe to us. Just type in Guilt, Grace, Gratitude Podcast, hit subscribe. You can actually find, it's pretty user-friendly. You can find all our seasons kind of categorized. So it's a little bit more user-friendly to know, what to watch and what episodes. So check out the playlists on that. And you heard me mention Logos Bible Software. So they are our main sponsor, and we're very grateful for that. And so all our sponsors, whether they're companies, publishers, or people, we call bridge builders. So halfway through this episode, we're going to have a few ads focused on some of our sponsors, or some words from our sponsors as well. And if you are an individual person and you are able and willing to give anything to us, it would help our bandwidth and grow. We're a couple of years old in this podcast, and with any podcast, there's a lot of background stuff that you guys don't know and hear and see too much, but there's a lot of editing and other things going on. So, and needed equipment and things like that. So that helps us out a lot. But we want to keep this show free for everybody in the world. So don't feel like you're obligated to do that. But yeah, we will. I'll let Peter further introduce Doctors Terry Muck and Harold Netland.
Yeah, we have Dr. Terry Muck, who's been a religious studies scholar for more than 35 years. Prior to his retirement, he served as executive director of the Louisville Institute after teaching for many years at Austin Presbyterian Seminary and Asbury Theological Seminary, and co-edited and authored numerous books, and as well as Dr. Harold Netland. And Dr. Harold Netland is professor of philosophy of religion and intercultural studies at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois, where he has taught for more than 25 years. Also served as a missionary in Japan and taught at Tokyo Christian University. We'll dive into that a little bit as well. But it's a pleasure having you both on to talk about world religions in general, missions, all that stuff. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Yeah, great to be here.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys coming on and talk about your experience. This will be a fun episode, I think, for those who are learning about different systems and different traditions and how to interact with those traditions. So we'll start first, and Dr. Muck, since you're the first one to show up on Zoom, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Dr. Netland after this. Let our listeners know more than I talked about in the bio, about yourself, your background, your work, and what got you interested in studying world religions.
Well, I was always interested in other religions. I was the kind of guy who, when the Jehovah's Witnesses came to the front door, I
You're
invited
happy.
him back.
Yeah.
And my mom didn't like that very much, but I just found it interesting. And then I think what focused my interest a little bit was when I was in high school, I read Mahatma Gandhi's biography, My Experiment with Truth.
Yep.
And it's just a great book. And he was obviously a great man. And it just interested me so much. I got interested in Indian religions. And from there on, I just kind of oriented my education. And then what I taught, I became a professor, was always world religion oriented, mostly Asian religions. And it has been a great way to spend an academic career.
Awesome. Yeah, and Dr. Netland, what about you?
Yeah, let me just add on Terry. He has been involved for over 3 decades, probably close to 4 decades, in an academic forum, Buddhist Christian Studies. And so he's an expert on Buddhism, but he's been very much engaged in dialogue and conversation with Buddhists over the years.
There we go.
I grew up in Japan. My parents were missionaries, came back to the States and spent 11 years in California, ended up doing a PhD in philosophy. 2 individuals in my graduate studies had influence on me. One was my mentor, John Hick, who was a complete pluralist, but a very, very fine teacher. And so he forced me to begin to really deal with questions of other religions and theology of religions. The other was a Japanese Zen Buddhist, Abe Masao. Very nice, sweet man. And he forced me to take a hard look at Buddhism. And so we spent 10 years in Japan in a variety of ministries. 1993, we came to the States, and I've been at TEDS ever since. One of the first courses they told me to teach was World Religions. And I've been doing it ever since, and I learn each time I do it.
Awesome.
There you go. I like it.
And there's a fun fact about Dr. Muck.
Yeah, I do way too much. I do way too much research on each one of our guests, and so I find little nuggets here and there. But yeah, what were you gonna say, Nick?
Yeah, let the audience know for the baseball fans.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Dr. Muck, you played baseball before your kind of religious studies days, right?
I did. I played actually minor league baseball in the Atlanta Braves farm system. Cool. And enjoyed it. I always wanted to be a professional baseball player. I got to do it. I didn't get to do it very long, but
but you got to do it. Not many can say that.
Got to do it. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And so, were you happy about last year? Were you rooting for the Braves to win it all?
I always root for the Braves.
Oh, there you go.
That's your team.
Yeah. So you were flying high at the end of 2021. Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah. Cool. Good deal. So, what are, I guess, my first question would be, what are some of the most dominant religious systems in the world today, both Eastern and Western? And has the number of adherents to these various systems changed in any way in line with population growth?
So the major families of religions, and I think it's good to think of these as large families, not monolithic traditions, but Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, smaller numbers, Judaism, Sikhism, and so on. But even within those large families, there's just enormous diversity. And the numbers have held fairly steady. Worldwide, there is an increase in those who identify as non-religious.
Yeah.
And so there's a huge debate on secularization, what it means, whether it's happening or not. But overwhelmingly, most people still identify with some religious tradition.
And Dr. Muck, if you can speak to that too.
The second part of your question, the membership in these religions, to a certain extent, does follow cultural membership. You know, Christians dominate in the West. Confucian is kind of a worldview that underlies huge segment of the East. And so the growth has pretty much followed those. Buddhism is an interesting case in that it has proven to be one of the more able cross-cultural religions. That is, it's entered into cultures that are not Asian, and so there's been some growth there, although it's not nearly as large as Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism.
Yeah, we've both, so we read a few things. I've heard that Buddhism tends to cross cultural boundaries. I mean, since your research, like what about Buddhism kind of crosses these cultural boundaries?
Well, if you look at the history of Buddhism started in India with the Buddha, actually Nepal, and then just spread to Tibet first of all, and then China, and then even the West, China, Japan, and then the West. And its great skill was partnering in each of those settings with an indigenous religion of some sort. In Tibet, it partnered with a religion called Bon. It managed to coexist with Confucianism in China, and even in Japan, it has a relationship with Shinto of sorts. In the West, the interesting thing about Buddhism is its partner in the West really has been science more than anything else. Buddhists never tire of claiming that the change that scientists observe daily in the natural world is very similar to the change that the Buddha taught about. So that's an interesting partnership.
I would just add on the adaptability of Buddhism. It has adapted to local conditions by absorbing the local cultural and religious traditions into itself.
Yeah, it's relatively syncretistic, like it takes in other things.
It takes different forms. And in Japan, when we were there was a very active debate among Japanese Buddhist scholars on whether Zen Buddhism is really Buddhism at all. And this was an internal debate, but some would go back to what they thought were the earlier traditions in Southeast Asia and say Zen has been so influenced by Chinese and Japanese traditions, this is no longer faithful. I don't know, but it just indicates how much the tradition can and has adapted as it moves into different contexts.
Yeah, so this I think that's a beautiful segue into this next question. And you've already kind of talked about this a little bit, and people tend to hear and you guys can correct this if it's wrong, but there's a substantial difference. They'll think culturally between Western and Eastern traditions, and you'll hear this kind of traditionally or culturally speaking. Does this hold true for kind of the dominant Western and Eastern religious traditions? Like the same cultural traditions kind of seep into the religious traditions, and if so, how closely do they tend to align culturally? So how closely do the religions tend to align with the culture of whatever that is, if it's Eastern or Western, if that makes sense? So maybe Dr. Netland, if you want to start on that one, kind of cultural differences between Western, does that hold true for the religions themselves?
I really don't like the East-West divide generalization.
It tends to like really talked about a lot.
Right. For one thing, I mean, usually when we talk about Western religions, we're talking about Christianity.
Yeah.
And then you immediately assume European American Christianity is kind of the norm.
Yep.
Right.
And it's a Middle Eastern. It's Middle Eastern in its origin.
Exactly. Yep.
True.
And you have theistic traditions in India, and some forms of Mahayana Buddhism have strong theistic overtones. So I think we need to be careful about generalizing too much East versus West. But I think it is fair to say that Christianity, Islam, Buddhism certainly, as they've moved through different cultural contexts, they do adapt to the local context and take on some of the coloring of the local cultural texture.
Yeah, Dr. Muck, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that too.
Well, I would just add that it is in the social context that they tend to, well, they have to deal with the social context. So in the East, both India and China has some form of caste system or social structure that the religions there either endorsed or had to deal with. The Buddha was opposed to the caste system in India, but he had to deal with it. You had, and in the West, we have our class systems, but they're not based so much on birth as they are on economic and social status.
Yep. Yeah. What kind of job you have? All that stuff.
And as Christians and Muslims, we have to deal with that in our own way. So it's a really difficult question, a big question here.
Yeah.
But and so to say that they follow the social pattern of the culture in which they are is not right, but they have to deal with it either positively or negatively.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, before my question, since we're talking about East and West distinctions, and this question wasn't necessarily on our list of questions to send you, but it just kind of came up in my mind since we're talking about East and West distinctions. And this is more of an observation on my end and maybe things that I've heard, so please correct me if I'm wrong or anything. But it seems like, as an American, just my observation is this: people that say they're spiritual tend to tie, there's a rise in like things like yoga and New Age and Hinduism and Buddhism in the West where we are, but also on the flip end, places like China and Africa, Christianity is growing the fastest in the world. Is all that correct, do you think?
Well, what you're talking about is what we sometimes just all throw under the category of globalization. And we are interconnected on many, many levels globally, culturally, economically, religiously, politically, and so on. So you do see this transfer of images, practices, beliefs moving in many directions. And your mention of Christianity in Africa and China was one of the reasons I really resist talking about Christianity as a Western religion, because
it's bigger over there.
Overwhelmingly, most Christians today are not European or American. And this is one of the great changes of the 20th century. It's just absolutely remarkable how the composition of the church has changed.
Interesting. Okay, cool. So Dr. Muck got a question here. When engaging with the dominant religions of the world, doesn't matter if it's Eastern or Western, I could put air quotes in there based on this. Is there a consistent mistake Christians fall into when approaching conversations around various faiths?
Well, let me mention two. One is a tendency, especially for people like Harold and I, to overemphasize the rational aspects of religion, and forget that it is as much relational as it is rational. That is, we're dealing with real live people here who have beliefs, and I think to categorize them as simply thinking machines is a mistake, and to remember that they are, sincere searchers, maybe right, maybe wrong, but they are people, and we have to emphasize the relational aspect as much as anything. I suppose the other thing I would mention as a common mistake or misdirection to go is something Harold alluded to a minute ago, and that is that we tend to project our issues, our Christian issues, onto other religions. And we think, well, since we're interested in sin, all religions are interested in sin, or whatever we mean by sin. And so we speak before we listen. And I think we assume we know what people of other religions are thinking about and worrying about, and we probably don't. And so we should ask questions and listen before we begin to compare notes.
Okay. Yeah, we've had other conversations with other people that kind of lend to that as well, where you rightly or wrongly, you place a system on the person, and so you talk to the system, you don't talk to the person, and then you assume either a lot about the system because you follow Christianity, quote unquote, they follow Buddhism, whatever it is, and so you assume based off their system, this is what they believe that's different from my system, and so you talk about those differences, like you said, versus talking to the person, not the system.
Yes. Yeah.
One example of that, very quickly, it's easy for Christians to assume that other religions that have sacred texts regard their sacred texts exactly the way that we look at the Bible. And so this is an inspired text from God, fully authoritative, when we try to live our lives according to that. Buddhist texts are very different. And similarly with many of the Hindu texts. And so, as Terry said, we need to listen first. And how do you understand what it means to be a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Muslim? What does your sacred text mean for you? How do you work with that?
Yeah, that's helpful. That's really helpful. And then Dr. Netland, this one's more directed towards you. And in line with our previous question, what was your experience like as a missionary in Japan? So some people, we have some listeners in Japan. I'm sure we have people who've visited Japan or whatnot. What are some of the dominants? I think people think they know the dominant religions there, but what are actually the dominant religions there? And separately, their assumptions about the Christian faith. So not our assumptions about them, but their assumptions about the Christian faith.
Oh my, okay. I'll keep it short.
Sorry for a big question.
Yeah, no. Japan's a wonderful country. I mean, Ruth and I just really enjoyed being there. I've been gone for 30 years. So
things have changed, probably.
Things have changed. However, if you ask a Japanese person, are you religious? Invariably, they'll say no. If you say, what is your religion? They'll say Buddhist. I personally think it's a very secularized society. And there are studies on Japanese religion which show a marked decline in the regular practices and markings of Buddhist participation. But it's still a very kind of spiritual, quasi-religious society. And so it's a curious place. Shinto would be the indigenous tradition. It's a religion that is tied to the Japanese people. It makes no sense for someone like me to try and convert to Shinto. They wouldn't know what to do with me. It's not a missionary religion. It's for the Japanese people. But it affects their understanding of afterlife, nature, the spiritual realm. And so although it's a highly secularized society in many ways, it's a haunted society. Their spirits, their ghosts, their occult powers that people take very, very seriously. Their perspective of Christianity, Christians are nice people. Christian ethics is good. It's not for the Japanese. If you're Japanese, you're not Christian.
But not to say there are some Christians in Japan, obviously.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And the Christians are wonderful, strong Christians, but at most 1% of the population, Protestant or Catholic.
Gotcha.
Have you, by any chance, have you read the book Silence and Beauty by Makoto Fujimura?
Yeah.
I've read that. Does he have I think he's from Japan.
Yes.
Is that like, does he have this is maybe a terrible question, but is that kind of the stuff you're talking about? Because he talks about a lot of this stuff, kind of the underlying religious traditions, how they've interacted with Christianity, what it's like to be a Japanese Christian, like you kind of feel like an outsider a little bit.
Yes, exactly. And the book that book is referring to, the novel Silence by Endo Shusaku, is precisely struggling with those issues. Can one really be authentically Japanese and a Christian?
Yeah, it was an interesting read for me coming from the outside, wondering like how does a Christian relate to Japanese people, and how does Japan and their culture kind of take in or not take in some Christian? And there's the stepping on the Fumi stone, I think it was.
Fumiya. Yes.
Yeah, Fumiya stone. Had some like representation of Christ. It was for those who are listening, it's a fascinating read. Both Endo and then this book too.
Yes.
So after that's helpful for some of this stuff. And so first part of an attached question, and Nick will ask the other part of this. And maybe Dr. Muck, we can start with you on this one. What are some, or Dr. Netland, whoever thinks they can hit this one out. What are some indigenous, because in this book there are some indigenous religious traditions that are described as well, which I think our listeners are probably not as familiar with. We're more familiar with like kind of traditional, larger traditions. People know Buddha, Shinto, Catholic, Judaism, all that stuff. But some indigenous religious traditions that most are not aware of, that you think people should be aware of. Like what are some of those that you think are helpful for us to be aware of?
Well, it's a difficult question in some ways, but it depends on what you mean by indigenous religious traditions. I think that in the cultures I'm familiar with, most in the West, economism, what I call economism, is an indigenous movement that infects all religions in the West. And that is that everything seems to be measured by profit and loss. And this is a movement that really is foreign to most world religions, at least foreign in the ideal sense. And I think that it's harmful to religion, because most religions, world religions, have basically taught some kind of altruism, some kind of value in not considering the cost for what we do as religious people. And that is almost countercultural in the cultures we live in, where that's all you consider is the cost. Will this be good for me? Will this be good for my family? Will this be profitable for me?
Which tends to be the American mindset.
I think the mindset's a good word. The underlying economic, I mean, look at the heroes on TV. It's Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and all these billionaires who are the people we at least pay attention to. We maybe not look up to them so much, but we pay attention to them. And I think it's because of this, the role that money and economics has come to play in our culture.
Sure.
Yeah. And Dr. Netland, I don't know if you have anything to add to that as well.
No, I'd agree, but there are literally hundreds and hundreds of what are called new religious movements, and depending on how far back you want to go. But coming out of Japan, there's the tradition of Soka Gakkai, which
I remember reading about that.
Emerged out of Nichiren Buddhism, but then split off. It's gone international. It's taken on a new form, is very much a humanitarian, educational, peace promoting humanist society. So it raises questions, is this still authentically Buddhist? Is it something else? But it's a global movement. Even within the American tradition, if you go back, you look at things like Unitarianism or Mormonism, these are distinctively American contributions to the modern religious scene.
Yeah. Yeah, that actually bridges into this question quite well. to not lose any motivation, momentum that you were saying, Dr. Netland. Here's a good question. What are some new religious trends that are detached from historical traditions, and how might they both build off and separate from their religious forebears?
Yeah. Let me mention one, and it's hard to do justice to this in just a couple of minutes, but it's something we need to be aware of because it is a phenomenon, and in missiological circles, it's getting a lot of attention. And this is a question of multiple religious identity. And yeah, it raises questions about, what is religion? What is culture? What's ethnicity? What is national identity? And as Terry mentioned, I think at the beginning of our time, for many religious persons, religion is a kind of marker of identity.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not so much that they've studied the doctrines and the creeds and they're practicing devoutly every day, but it's very much an identity marker for them. And so in the secular literature, there's a lot of discussion on multiple religious identity. Can someone participate in or identify with several different religious traditions simultaneously? What would that mean? You're also having that discussion in missiological circles. Can someone call themselves a Muslim disciple of Jesus? What does Muslim mean there? And the discussion now has expanded. Can someone call themselves a Hindu disciple of Jesus or a Buddhist disciple of Jesus? I think our gut reaction is just to say, well, no, of course not. John 14:6.
Yep.
But there are complicated questions about identity here that we need to navigate very carefully. And so I would just caution Christian brothers and sisters, don't dismiss that discussion prematurely. There's some real issues at work there.
Yeah, which has to do with what Dr. Muck said on some of the problems that Christians run into when they engage with other faith traditions, where you assume like, I'm just a Christian, you must be just whatever you are. So let's talk about this stuff, forgetting a lot of this structure as well.
And also to add to that, would it be also in the same vein of what you're saying is Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses trying to say that they are Christian?
Yeah, well, I mean, they do have the Christian identity in their label or title, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So on one level, clearly they are Christian in some sense.
In name.
Yeah. So, I mean, when demographers do their demographic studies, you have to take that into account. The normative question is, what does it really mean to be a Christian or a disciple of Jesus? Have they crossed boundaries there? And most traditional Christians would say yes. But even there, we need to remember these are not static entities. Yeah. And as Terry mentioned, these are real people we're talking about. Yeah. So people are in journey, and it's possible.
It may not be so cut and dry.
It may not be so cut and dry, and individuals may not be right in line with what the institutional teaching would have them to be.
Yeah. I don't know, Dr. Muck, if you want to, because it sounds a lot like the stuff that you're talking about, mistakes that Christians make when they engage with other traditions. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit more as well.
Yeah, well, to pick up on your last question, how to begin a conversation with people of other religions, I think we're often way too eager to try and begin with the differences between our religions.
True.
And I always counsel people who ask this question to start with the similarities. If you're talking to a Muslim, for example, you might say, I understand your view of the Quran is very intense. As Christians, we feel the same way about our Bible, and talk about that similarity, not necessarily the similarity of the text, but the similarity of the passion for their religious writing. And then once you get that conversation going and gain trust and relational value, then you can begin to move into some of the more distinctive differences. I had a professor in college, Edmund Perry, who I could always count on Edmund having one question on the midterm or the final exam that would begin compare and contrast X with Y. And his point was that when you're dealing with any religious category, there are probably similarities with the way you as a Christian view that category and the way a Buddhist might, but there are also distinct differences. And don't forget either one. And I think that's kind of a great rule for interreligious interactions.
And the ultimate similarity amongst all of us is that we're all made in the image of God. Does that help as well?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
for sure. Of course, that's the Christian way of putting it.
Yeah.
A Buddhist would say it differently. But the world religions anyway tend to view all people as of a certain sort, and they tend to view all people as being inherently religious, whatever that means to them. And that's also a good place to start. I notice your religious passion. Tell me about it, and get them talking.
Yeah, maybe this will help ground it a little bit too. And this wasn't on the questions, but hopefully this helps people understand, because we've been talking a lot about Christian engagement with other cultures or other traditions or whatever it may be, other religious kind of convictions, whether it's many convictions, one person, or one conviction, whatever it is. And I think we tend to know like the quote unquote the American way of doing it, which is like you find the differences, like it's black and white, you're wrong, I'm right, whatever it is. Is that how other religious traditions would talk to Christians or talk to, so like, is that the way like a Muslim would talk to a Sikh, or a Sikh would talk to, or not a Sikh, like a Shinto or a Buddha? Like, is that how other religious traditions talk to each other and like engage religiously? Is that how they, like, do they find like these are our differences, or are they more common approaches? Does that question make sense? Where I think we tend to know the American like black and white approach versus outside of America, how they approach these conversations.
Well, I think it's hard to generalize, but I think we need to avoid the assumption that all these other religions are just one big happy family, agreeing to disagree. I mean, there's some real tensions between traditions. They're usually not just religious. It's ethnic, economic, a variety of things. But I think it is fair to say that the relational dimension is more important to many other groups of people than it is to Americans. We tend to want to just cut to the chase. Let's get to the truth question.
Give me the answer, whatever it is.
And you need a relationship of trust in many other contexts before they're going to be comfortable talking about that kind of a question.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and this statement is a very Christian thing of me to kind of my angle saying, but so I think it seems like to me every faith, every religion outside of Christianity, when it comes down to it, is a faith plus works kind of thing. It's like having a belief in something, having faith in it, but also needing to do something and muster up to kind of a human made soteriology, where Christianity should be, and we also have inner dialogue with this, but it should be just faith saved by faith alone. Is that a correct assumption or statement?
I would really qualify that on two fronts. Even in Christianity, we are saved by grace through faith. But I think if you read Jesus carefully, those who are transformed that way manifest it in an identifiably different way of living. So it's not absolutely. It's not that the works save you, but they're part of the package.
Absolutely.
And in the other case, the Buddhist Pure Land tradition just does not fit that. And again, they're not talking about salvation as reconciliation with God, forgiveness of sin. The soteriological goal is rebirth in the Pure Land. But Shinran and his followers are absolutely clear. There is nothing we can do to earn or to merit rebirth in the Pure Land. And some of his writings are just hauntingly similar to what you hear from Martin Luther. It's really an amazing thing. Now, practicing Pure Land Buddhists, I think, like many practicing Christians, mix the works with this other merit. But as a formal system, you really cannot say Pure Land Buddhism has a soteriology based upon human merit or human works. And so in our globalizing world too, I think we need to be careful about those kind of statements, because a lot of our students will take a course at community college or something or the other, and the professors love to throw Pure Land Buddhism at them and say, you think Protestants are so special. What about this? And so I think we do need to become a little bit more nuanced in how we think about that. This doesn't mean Pure Land Buddhism is just another variation of Protestant Christianity. It's not. It's Buddhist. But structurally, it's really hard to look at that and say that that has a soteriology based upon human merit or human works.
Yeah.
No,
Dr. Muck,
good.
I don't know if you want to add to that with some of the Eastern stuff.
I would add something that I always stressed with my students, and that was when you're comparing religions, there are two dimensions to any religion. There's the ideal of a religion, and there's the way that religion is actually practiced. And if you're comparing religions, make sure that you are comparing ideals with ideals, or practices with practices.
Good advice.
And don't get that mixed up. Don't say, well, we Christians believe, but you practice this. That's not fair. And so it's a good caution that helps get over some of these rather naughty complexities.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's like, because next question is the question that a lot of Christians have, and it's a question I have, but it's not how other, like, it's like you said, there's some religious traditions, like that's not even a question in their mind, or it's not how their system. So when you bring faith plus works, like what faith and what works are you talking about? That's like just not how we think of this religion or how we think of this tradition. Or it could be something completely different, but it's like you said, it's asking questions first versus saying, hey, this is what we believe, what do you believe? And let's find differences and then go from there. But it's actually, no, like, let's talk to you. What do you believe? How do you practice? What's your religion? All that stuff. That's helpful. I think Nick just froze, but so I'll ask the last question before we go off. And you already kind of talked about it, but how, like, maybe to kind of bring this all together, how should we have conversation? Like, how should we approach the conversations? And I think so often we think, no, I have to go to a different country to have a conversation with somebody of a different religious tradition and culture, when we likely have a neighbor who's next to us, we have a friend, family member, or whatever it is. How do you begin that conversation? Or how would you help us use this stuff to begin a conversation with? I think we think way too globally versus like the person next to you, your neighbor. Like, how do you start? Like, is this, I think, again, Christians want to think, or Americans think, like, oh, there's a way to start this, but how do we use some of this stuff to have a conversation with our friends?
Well, I think, friendships and relationships, Jesus' golden rule has so many applications. And a good question to ask is simply, how would I want to be treated by a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon if they were to approach me in a conversation? And well, I would hope that there would be a desire to become friends, establish a relationship, and have a non-threatening conversation. Well, then I think it's right for us to respond in the same way to them. And people can tell right away when they're being made a project.
Yeah.
And they don't like
a relationship. You're just trying to get to like, how do I convert you?
Yep. Yep. And like Terry said, just asking questions. You're a Muslim. Tell me what that means. I don't know much about Islam. What does it mean to be a Muslim? They'll be happy to tell you.
Yeah. Dr. Muck, I don't know if you want to add some stuff as well.
I would just add that, especially neighbors, I love the backyard over the fence conversation image. And religion is for most of us, it's a very personal thing.
Yeah.
And you may have to establish the relationship based on something other than religion, and become friends first, and then work your way into religion. It varies so much. Some people are eager to talk about their religion, but some aren't, and honor that and start somewhere else and become friends and then see what happens.
Yeah, that's helpful. I don't know if there's anything that you guys want to add. I know this by necessity has to be kind of a broad overview, and we can't really touch down on points. But if there's anything you want to add based off your research, your interests, and class you talk, things that may help others think well about this stuff. I think there's a way, I mean, again, generalizing, that Americans tend to approach these conversations and saying, no, I think there's a more fruitful way of talking about other religions and learning about them. And I mean, everybody has friends who believes in something that we don't believe in. But yeah, if there's nothing else, we can conclude and kind of go off from there. Is there anything you guys want to add to this conversation?
I'll just add one quick comment.
Yeah.
And that is that not everyone, as I said, wants to talk about religion right away. And so take your time and be ready to learn. I think one of our biggest faults is that we don't think we have anything to learn from a Buddhist, but you do. It will make your religion richer to learn about someone else's religion. And that's the only thing I guess I would add here at the end.
Great.
Good.